Welcome everyone. I'm Chebrolu, and it's my pleasure to share with you some of our recent research that I've done together with my colleagues here at the University of Bonn. We have looked into techniques for registering plant point clouds which have been acquired over a period of time and use these to develop automated phenotyping applications. The motivation for our work comes from the field of plant science, where phenotyping plays an important role. Phenotyping involves measuring different plant traits such as stem lengths, leaf areas or leaf lengths, and several other biological and anatomically important plant traits. These help the scientists to characterize the growth of a plant and to make certain decisions based on that particular characteristics. Here we see an example of crop breeding where different varieties of a crop are sown in different plots, as you see here. And then over time, different phenotypic traits are measured and recorded. These help the scientists to figure out which varieties are doing better and help them in taking further decisions in the crop breeding process. Currently, the approaches that are involved in measuring these traits are often time-consuming and laborious. Here we see an example of how the leaf area is being computed. The leaf is put inside the scanner, then a complete scan of the leaf is being made in order to compute such traits. And sometimes we even require to do some intrusive operations where leaves need to be cut or entire plants need to be derooted, so to say, in order to compute these traits. So the question that we ask here is, can we do better using robotics technology? Can we automate some of these processes? So we have to start out with first actually capturing this data. This could be inside a laboratory environment using a handheld laser scanner to obtain a plant point cloud, or this could be in the field where sensors can be put on board robots like these, which go inside the fields and measure the plants. Either way, we will end up with time series of measurements as seen here. In this case, these are a time series of 3D point clouds. And the question that we ask here is, given these time series of data, how do we actually register them with each other? As you can see visually, that the shape of these plants changes quite drastically due to the growth of the leaves, the stem, and various other parts. In addition to the growth, we also see that the topology of these plant changes as new leaves emerge. Right? On top of all this, you can also see a kind of a bending in these plants, which is forced by certain external disturbances like sunlight or wind or other factors. So given these challenges, we would like to develop techniques which are able to register these point clouds despite these challenges. So one of the ideas that we exploit in this work is the skeleton structure of the point cloud. So the skeleton, in a very compact manner, encapsulates the overall shape of the object, in this case our plant. In the literature, there are several methods for extracting the skeletons for different objects. However, with plants, these often fail because of the different shapes within a single plant. For example, the leaves are quite flat, whereas the stems are quite cylindrical, and this forces methods which only depend on local geometry to often fail. So we look at exploiting actually the semantics of the plants in order to drive the skeletonization process. So what we do in our work is to have a two-step process. We start out with the raw point cloud. And in the first step, we compute the semantics at an organ level or at a part level, which means we figure out what are the leaves, what are the stem, etc. And then once we have this information, we would do the skeletonization depending on this semantics information. The first step in the skeletonization process is to classify the input point cloud into either leaf points or stem points. We perform this classification using a support vector machine, an SVM model, which has been trained on a subset of the data for which manual labels have been provided. So once we have the leaf points and the stem points, we then cluster them. So for example, for each of the leaf points, we cluster them into separate leaves, as you see here, or even leaflets, and we separated them from the stem. The clustering is done using the popular density-based scan mechanism. So what we have now is a part-based or an organ-based classification of the input point cloud. Then we compute the skeletal structure for each one of these parts separately, which is much easier to do rather than to compute the skeleton of the whole plant. So we end up with these different small parts, which are then put together using the connection information that we had from before. So this extraction of this small parts or these small skeletons is done using self-organizing maps, which are unsupervised learning methods and help us figure out what the skeleton structures for the individual parts are. Once we have the skeletons, the next step is to do a matching between these skeletons in order to obtain some data associations. So what we have is the point cloud and the corresponding skeletons which we have just computed. And then the question now is which nodes in the skeleton S1 correspond to which nodes in skeleton S2. As we see here, the matching skeletons here might not have the same topology. For example, here there's one more leaf present than you see here. And also sometimes the skeleton extraction process is not perfect. So we need to come out with a skeleton matching process which is able to take these into account. So in this work, we pose the correspondence estimation problem as an inference over a hidden Markov model. The hidden variables of this model or the unknowns of this model are the correspondences between these two skeletons. As is typical with an HMM, we first define an emission cost. This emission cost is defined for each correspondence. So this cost consists of two terms. The first term is a difference in the degree of these nodes. So for example, here the node Ni has a degree of 3 as it has 3 edges attached to it, whereas the one for Nj is 4. And the second term is one that sees how close these two nodes are to each other. So in effect, we want those correspondences which have similar degrees and which are closer to each other in the Euclidean space. Next, we define the transition cost. Here the transition cost is defined for a pair of correspondences Cij and Ckh. The first term of this transition cost is the distance between these nodes along the skeleton. So in this case, this is the distance between the node Ni and Nk along the skeleton, whereas the dg of Nij corresponds to the distance between the node Nj and Nh along the skeleton here. So what we want is to have correspondences basically which are similarly distributed along the skeleton. The next term we have here takes into account the number of branches between Ni, Nk and Nj, Nh correspondingly. So essentially this term wants us to match those correspondences which support a similar shape or a similar topology between the corresponding nodes. And finally, we have a term which penalizes, so to say, the direction of the nodes that have been joined by Cij and Ckh. So essentially, this would avoid us giving correspondences which cross each other. So once we define these costs, we basically compute them for all possible correspondence pairs and end up with a model like here. And then the correspondences are basically given by an inference on this hidden Markov model. So in our work, we use the standard Viterbi algorithm to perform this inference. And the solution to this inference is the set of correspondences which lower the energy that we just mentioned. So what we would end up with is basically these yellow lines, which are the estimated correspondences between the skeleton S1 and S2. Once we have the correspondences between the skeletons, the next step is to estimate the deformation or the registration parameters between these two skeletons. So what we have are the two skeletons, the source skeleton S1 and the target skeleton S2, and the correspondences shown here in yellow from the previous step. So the question that we ask here is how to map the source skeleton S1 onto S2. So we model the deformation parameters using an affine transformation which is attached to each node in the source skeleton. We choose an affine transformation because it has the ability to track shearing as well as other scaling effects. So the problem of registration is actually now converted into an optimization problem over these unknown parameters of the affine transformation for each node that minimizes a certain energy. And the first part of this energy is a correspondence energy, which tries to bring the corresponding points on the two skeletons as close to each other. The next part of this energy is what is called as a rotational energy, which tries to keep the rotational component of this affine transformation as close to a true rotation as possible. This is necessary in order to keep the shearing effects in check. And finally, we have a third energy called as the regularization energy, which tends to keep the estimation for nodes which are close by similar to each other. This again results in deformations that are more natural rather than being sheared unnaturally. We combine these three types of energies to give us a total energy. And then we solve the deformation parameters as an optimization problem by minimizing a nonlinear least squares problem. And we use the standard Gauss-Newton algorithm to compute the solution. We also use the Cauchy's robust kernel for the correspondence terms in case there are some wrong correspondences coming from the matching step, that it does not completely drag the solution away from the actual minimum. With this optimization process, we have computed the deformation parameters which map the skeleton S1 to S2. The next step is actually to transfer this deformation to the entire point cloud. The way we do this is to pick up a point in the source point cloud and then project it onto the corresponding skeleton. And then we use the k nearest transformations on that skeleton to transform it on top of our target skeleton, which is shown here in the pink points. So this way we are able to extend the deformation computed for the skeleton points to the entire point cloud. So now I would like to give a quick summary of the different steps that we have seen. So we start out with the 2 point clouds P1 and P2. Then we compute the corresponding skeletons exploiting the semantics. And then we have an iterative process where we iterate between finding the skeletal correspondences as well as using these correspondences to find the deformation parameters. So we repeat these steps till that time where the correspondences that have been estimated do not change. So in a way, this is quite typical or quite similar to the iterative closest point algorithm. And once we come out with our deformation parameters, we then extend it or apply it to the entire point cloud to obtain the deformed point cloud. So this is the iterative non-rigid registration scheme that we have come up till now. So now I would like to show you some registration results on some examples. So here you see 2 point clouds along with their skeletons, and in the middle you see the estimated correspondences. And using these correspondences, we computed the deformation parameters and applied them to the complete point cloud to obtain the results here on the right. We also test this on a more difficult data set which have been acquired 4 days apart from each other. So we see that there is quite a large change in between the shape of these 2 point clouds. As we can see in the center, we are still able to reliably obtain the correspondences and then finally deform the overall point cloud as well. So what we do now is to apply this registration procedure on the time series data as you see here. So we do the registration between consecutive scans both for a tomato plant as well as a maize plant over a period of 2 weeks. And then with this we can come out with graphs which look like this. So what you see here is that we are able to compute certain phenotypic traits, so in this case leaf area as well as the stem length. And then we are able to do this over a period of time. So we are only able to do this since we have the registration results as well as the data associations from before, so that we can automatically generate these graphs which show the growth of the plants. In addition to the continuous tracking of certain traits, we can also detect certain interesting topological events. For example, in this case, each of these numbers correspond to the number of new leaves that have emerged on those particular days. We can do this since we have the skeletal structures, and from this we can extract or figure out when new leaves have emerged. Finally, we also interpolate the data in between actual measurements. So what you see here in pink is the interpolated point cloud. The one on the right which is in green is the target one, and one on the left is the source point cloud. So what we see here is as the target point cloud approaches the interpolated point cloud, the shape of the interpolated point cloud morphs into the one of the target one. You will see now as the difference between the target and the source point clouds is quite high, our registration approach is able to smoothly deform into this final point cloud. The experimental results that I have shown in this presentation are based on data which are captured using such a handheld scanner in a laboratory environment. So the point clouds that we obtain are quite high quality and very accurate. However, this is not the case if you go to robots which are operating in the fields. We may have data which is much more noisier, which is much more incomplete. So the next step is to extend these techniques which work on such perfect data to data that has been obtained from fields in the real world. Finally, I would like to give you a summary. I have introduced a technique for registering 3D point clouds of plants which have been acquired over a period of time. We do this by exploiting the skeleton structure, which is computed by using the semantics of the plant. We are able to capture the growth of the plant, the non-rigidity, by estimating deformation parameters over the time. We also show how to use this registration results in order to develop phenotyping applications and show how we can track the plant traits over time. We are also able to interpolate point clouds at times at which no measurement is actually present. So we can use this for visualization purposes or for prediction purposes. The source code as well as the dataset for the work that I have shown in this presentation is available online. With that, I thank you for your attention.